Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Odyssey House Journals. I'm Randall Carlisle. My co-host is Rachel Santizo.
Hello.
And our very special guest today is Salt Lake County District Attorney Sim Gill. We're going to get to you in a minute, Sim. I just want to let people know we're one of the most watched and listened to podcasts dealing with addiction and recovery. And you can watch us or listen to us on YouTube or iTunes or iHeart or any of those things. And we have a new member of the family, KKAT 860 AM radio in Salt Lake City. So even though we have people watching and listening around the world, if you live in Salt Lake, Saturday and Sunday morning at 10 a.m., you can catch this podcast. So,
great, thank you.
So welcome to all our KCAT listeners. Welcome to you, Sim. Thank you very much for being here. Let's start out with, and we deal with this all the time at Odyssey House, and you deal with it all the time. How would you assess how the criminal justice system deals with people in addiction or with mental health issues?
Well, I think over the last 28 years, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation. It's absolutely my privilege and pleasure to be here. Over the last 28 years as a public prosecutor, I've developed a hypothesis, and my hypothesis is when public policy makers fail to address the issue of social justice, economic justice, political justice, public health, education, job, and affordability, those public policy deficits manifest themselves as crises in our community. And then our public policy makers have relied upon our criminal justice system and law enforcement to be our crisis managers.
So they say to you, we've got this issue out here, but you take care of it.
That's exactly right. And then in the application of that crisis management over our history has disproportionately impacted communities of color and poverty. And I used to say by accident, but I say by design because it is too efficient, too effective of a model. And so as a result, the light bulb that went off in my head was when I was a line prosecutor and I just convicted somebody when I was just first starting out. Now we're at the sentencing phase of it, and I'm trying to figure out where am I going to keep this person? Where is he going to shelter? How am I going to feed this person? Where am I going to get the physical health needs of this person met? How am I going to address the mental health and the addiction issues of this person? How am I going to stabilize them long enough so they can actually get a skill so they can earn a living and support their family? And we have not yet even touched upon the trauma and everything that led that person to that moment. And every one of those things that I'm identifying, and there were far more than that, were all public policy deficits that were upstream, that were not met, and that did not exist. And as a result, I'm the crisis manager for those failed policies. And
so you take the criticism when it doesn't work, whatever they determined you need to do, and the credit, I guess, when it does work. But
and let's be clear, right? There's everybody intuitively understands the difference between violence and somebody who is a risk to the public safety of you or Rachel or me and our family, versus those individuals whose conduct and existence we have criminalized and we dislike. So it's not about disliking someone or othering somebody. It's about, for me, criminal justice should be about that violence. It should be focused on the public safety component. But historically, it has become a management of poverty, mental illness, addiction, and these other traumas that are incorporated in that existence that we as a society do not want to take responsibility for, but we also don't want to see it. So we want to criminalize that behavior, and we want to lock you away rather than deal with you. And that's something that I'm not interested in participating in. If you're a violent offender, yes. Everybody else, we need to take a different approach. And that's why I'm a huge supporter of restorative justice principles and therapeutic justice models as an avenue of returning dignity and humanity back to those individuals who simply have become numbers moving through a system for us.
Which all sounds ideal, right? You would agree with everything he said, Rachel, right?
Absolutely.
But how do we do that? Because we've made some inroads with drug courts and mental health courts and stuff like that. but we still have this huge issue to deal with that doesn't seem to be happening right now.
I think we have to, first of all, recognize that the politicians that we elect, the policymakers that we elect, they fundamentally work for us. We do not work for them. The second thing that we have to do is that we have to start having very honest conversations about these issues, because this is not something out of sight, out of mind kind of an approach. And we need to start relying on science and data and evidence-based approaches rather than emotional and knee-jerk responses. Again, public safety, and that let's put that to the side, but everything else. What's fascinating about the American criminal justice system and policy, you look at like Norwegian and countries and Norway, Sweden, their policymakers look to the subject matter experts to bring the research and inform them so they can actually create good laws that are supportive of that scientific evidence. Here, we go from an emotional component and deny the presence of anybody who's got scientific or subject matter expertise, and we create laws differently. And as a result, ours is an emotional response to our issues rather than a scientific and thoughtful response to that. The other part of it is, under our current system, we cannot sustain the trajectory of mass incarceration. We spend billions of dollars, and there was an exponential growth from the mid-70s to the 80s when the war on drugs began. And we went from spending about $6 or $7 billion as a nation 2 decades later in excess of $70 to $80 billion.
Wow.
And now there's a research that came out that says all the collateral impact of that approach is almost in excess of $200 billion a year. Ooh. So we cannot jail our way out of it. We cannot afford our way out of it. And so we need to come up with a better approach. Even if you don't care about human beings, but you want to make a fiscal argument, there it is. But there's
which is sometimes easier to make.
Yeah. And there's a human argument to be made here as well, which is getting lost in this conversation.
Yeah, I love and appreciate everything that you're saying. I also think with the scientific and evidence-based, I think something that is lacking is lived experience.
Yes.
It's bringing in that lived experience to be able to say, to really be that boots on the ground and to paint what it's like and what the barriers are and how to get through it, because it's a cycle that's created. And then there's more barriers. There's criminal records. You can't get a job. You can't get employment. And so it's not the violence factor. It's that it's all that you know. And it becomes this cycle because all the odds are against you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's because what we have done by othering that person, we have dehumanized them. We do not look at the dignity and the individuality of that person. That person ceases to be a person. They become a statistic. They become a conduct, right? And then we have this idea that this one idea of justice is that you're getting your just dessert. You deserve this as a result. And not recognizing what you just said, Rachel, which is that there are also institutional barriers that are there. So now if you end up with a record, right, the whole idea of our criminal justice system is premised on the idea of rehabilitation. That means that if you do something wrong, you're held accountable, you pay your debt to society, as we say, but then you are welcomed back into that society's embrace, right? Because you have the same standing as me. But what we've done is we put the scarlet letter around you, and your criminal record is this scarlet letter for public shaming. And then as a result, you can't get a job. You can't feed yourself. You can't find a place to live. And as a direct consequence of this othering, your children and dependent also economically suffer from that. So now we have created an intergenerational cascading effect of that punishment. So this punishment goes from the sins of the fathers to their children and their grandchildren. And we think that's okay, but we're not consciously aware of that. And then all the collateral cost to that is picked up by all of us. So we not only are doubling down on a bad premise, but then we're also backing it up with our own hard resources in a failed approach, in a failed system.
So what would be the perfect, if you ran the world, okay, what would be the perfect way to deal with issues like drug addiction or mental health, and the peripheral crimes that go with them, like shoplifting and identity theft and things like that people do to support their habit, what would be ideal?
Well, I think first of all, it's about building resiliency from the get-go. It means that when we have families, that their basic needs are being met. They have access to medical care. They have access to good education. They have access to food. And so what is our responsibility? So people say, well, you're giving free stuff away. No, I'm saying we're investing in our community. We're investing in our society. That's what you do in a civilized society. You invest in it. It's a constant effort. It's a loop that feeds upon itself. So it's those early childhood interventions. It's about making sure that people can have access to jobs. They can have access to the skills and education so they can actually work for themselves. That if there is trauma that occurs, and no family is perfect, if there is trauma that occurs, we have mechanisms by which to address that trauma, because leaving that trauma unresolved downstream is going to cost us $25, $30 on a $1 investment that we could have made earlier on the system. Mm-hmm. So it's about thinking about our policy in a holistic way in the service of our community. That's the promise of American democracy and government, is that we come together to address the needs of us collectively without compromising our individuality. And that means there's a moral and ethical responsibility to every elected to think collectively and holistically, rather along party lines, or rather along political lines, rather along expediency, rather along lobbyist groups with special interests. So it is this holistic approach. My background's in philosophy, so I like systems approach, and we are interconnected to each other. Mm-hmm. I'm interconnected to two of you, and if I sat and spent long enough time, I would see that connection with you. But what we have done is we've created this artificial reality where we say that we are no longer connected to each other. Therefore, we can absolve of ourselves of our collective responsibility to each other by virtue of our human agency. And that's easily done when I demonize your conduct. It is easily done when I other you. It is easily done when I define your character by the mistakes that you have made. And therefore, I import a moral judgment upon you for what is a mistake that may have happened that all of us are capable of committing.
But too often, I mean, like Rachel was homeless down around the block, and too often a lot of the people, and now she's doing wonderful things. Okay, prime example of what can happen if you take part in treatment centers and things like that. But some of the people that we deal with, and the people who then influence the legislators, who then pass the screwed up laws that you have to enforce, say, Rachel's a heroin addict. She chose to be a heroin addict. She doesn't deserve to be treated the same way somebody else deserves to be treated. Well, and that's a prevalent view in society.
It is. And it's also a misunderstanding of what addiction is, right? And what the science of addiction is. At least my experience has been that a heroin addict does not sit there and says, let me see what crimes I can go and commit this morning. They say, I have a need, I am addicted. How do I feed that? Because the consequences of not feeding that addiction is devastating. So it becomes this almost biological necessity, this emotional necessity, which is perpetuated by that addiction. And the addiction drives you. It is not a rational thinking model. It is the expediency and the urgency of the addiction driving everything. From the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep, you are driven by that addiction. And your relationship, your conduct, your choices are dictated by that. And that's why we call it a disease. It's a physical, mental, emotional kind of a screwed up thing that happens. We can unravel it. We can build that resiliency. We can support that recovery if you understand what it is. But that means it requires effort. It requires that I see Rachel as a person and that she has value and worth and dignity as a person. And that means that is not the politically expedient thing to do,
or
popular thing to do. But I think with education, and I think this next generation that's coming up, we're seeing the science. There is a greater capacity for compassion and properly and proportionately putting the emphasis on what that is. So early on, if you look at mechanisms of support that, let me put it this way. If you have lung disease, we don't imprison you.
Right.
But if you have the addiction, if you have the disease of addiction, we want to imprison you.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And if you have a epileptic seizure and something happens from that, which can hurt somebody, we don't criminalize that.
Right.
Right? I'm using that as an illustrative example that we need to shift our paradigm. And for policymakers, okay, but beyond appealing to their compassion, we can appeal to their fiscal responsibility. This is the current model on the trajectory that it's at is not sustainable financially, apart from the human cost that it exacts, right? So if you want a better outcome, so take, for example, mental health issue. A person who's mentally ill going to the criminal justice system has a 72 to 74% recidivism rate if that issue is not addressed. But if I can, when I helped create the very first mental health court in the state of Utah almost 22 years ago, we said, what if we can get the medication to them? What we can give them supportive services? We can reduce that recidivism rate from 74, 75% down to about 19 and 22%.
Wow. And that's a huge difference.
And absolutely. And we know that somebody who's mentally ill, who's intersecting with the criminal justice system, they're going to have a major crisis event. When we looked at it, was every 200 days, a major crisis event where there's going to be a disruption in the community. By stabilizing them, I'm not curing mental illness, but I am maintaining it. I can extend that major crisis event from about 200 days to about 1,100 days.
Wow.
Okay, those 900 days that are there are not costing the taxpayer any money, right? But those multiple repeated crisis events are costing the taxpayer a lot of money. Yeah. So there's ways that we can look at it in a rational way where we can come up with some pragmatic solutions. Again, let me emphasize, without compromising public safety.
Right, and that's the key.
And
let's switch gears for a minute. Because legislators pass laws and you're tasked with enforcing them. Would you advocate eliminating all drug laws? Or, I mean, how do we deal with the drug situation? And people are talking about safe injection sites, a whole liberalizing the laws as they deal with drugs. Do you advocate for that?
What I advocate is a common sense approach, a evidence-based scientific approach to the nature, which are public health issues. What I advocate is not the criminalization of public health issues and all the collateral issues that are tied to that. What I advocate is early intervention and community support because many of those issues can be addressed, okay? And so I guess the analogy that I use is sort of like this. Right now, and historically, we take 10 addicts and we made them all 10 criminals. But if we have different phased-in levels of interventions, you may end up still with one addict who insists on not taking help and still insists on that behavior. But at the end of the equation, with each different filter or pathway of intervention, the criminal justice system may end up with one or two rather than 10 people right now. And that's okay. But then we'll know why we're ending up there with those two rather than blindly ending up with all 10 there right now. And that's a win-win for all of us.
So should we legalize drugs or not?
Well, I think we should certainly decriminalize them.
I use the wrong word
because I think we as a society have to evolve through it. And I think we have to acknowledge that there are collateral conduct that does disrupt and can harm people. So you have to have a remedy by which to be able to address that part of it, but you want to do it proportionately to that conduct rather than disproportionately. So we as a society have not yet evolved on that. We have not built the infrastructure of early interventions where we can achieve that. So to propose that as at the back end is still a huge sociological shift that we are not yet prepared to address and to internalize as a community of citizens. So I think this has to be done in stages by building the resiliency of the model early in the system, and then you build back into it. And the natural impact of what that will be, the decriminalization of that. And it will shift ultimately to the public health sector there where it belongs.
I think one of the most powerful things that you said is that 900 days.
Yeah.
Because thinking about those 900 days, I know that it extends time, but within those 900 days, that person gets to feel loved, supported,
Yes.
which is something that a lot of us have never felt in our life. We get to learn, we've known what we've known until that point that someone says, hey, I see you and here's a chance.
Yeah.
And then it's like changing that behavior around and changing all the internal thinking that we've had. Because when it's a moral issue, there's nothing that any of you can tell me that I'm not telling myself daily. You're just enhancing what I already feel.
Right.
And so that 900 days really stuck with me. I love that part.
And he brought up a point when you were in the throes of your addiction, did you wake up every morning saying, what kind of crime am I going to commit? Or did you wake up saying, how am I going to get my next fix of heroin?
How am I going to get it? And I also wasn't 12 years old saying, hey, I want to grow up to be a heroin addict either.
Yeah.
You know, in addition.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And each one of us as human beings have complex lives. Each one of us as human beings undergo sometimes unfairly levels of trauma that impact us. And we need resolution and support for that. And it has this snowballing effect that moves into the choices that we make. People think that sometimes that we live in this perfect world where I have this menu option of rational choices and that I get to pick and choose from. But we all know intuitively and through our experience, we are shaped by our experience. We're shaped by our early life, and it does impact. And our choices are already preordained to some extent of how I'm predisposed to address that issue. There was a fascinating study that was done a few years ago and here's what everybody, all the viewers and listeners will understand. It doesn't take a huge rational leap to understand if a child is physically abused, sexually abused, verbally abused, and undergo through that kind of mistreatment and torture, that they're going to end up messed up when they grow up, and they're going to make poor choices as a result of it. And they're more likely criminologically to engage in what we would call engage in deviant behavior. But the same study also found that beyond child abuse, which everybody understands, that child neglect is a co-contribute to the subsequent criminogenic outcome. That means failure to thrive, failure to feel loved, failure to have shelter, to have those other elements which we take for granted in a home that is already shaping us into the choices we will be making. So the failure to thrive is a co-contributor to subsequent criminality. So that is those policy universe that I'm talking about.
I can't tell you how many of our clients nowadays say my parents were either drug addicts or drug dealers.
Yeah.
And that's how they grew up.
Yeah.
We only have a little bit of time left. Do you have faith in the future? What do you think? You're talking about sociological changes that are going to improve things. Do you think it'll happen?
I have faith in people, Randall. That's what I have faith in people. I believe that when you see the dignity of the person before you and you engage in a respectful interaction with that person, anything is possible. I have faith in the community of our citizens who recognize that we cannot continue to do this in the same way. So I have a faith in the power of people to want to have different outcomes and to exercise their franchise to their elected and policymakers, saying we want and we deserve and we demand something different. We want you to be engaged and we're not going to let you be unaccountable. So I have never lost my faith in humanity. I have never lost my faith in the person sitting next to me. What I do recognize is that it's very easy for me to demonize. I have to acknowledge that in my own self as my own bias and predisposition, that I can be influenced to demonize somebody. And I have to constantly work on that. But if I can sit down with somebody and we just see each other as people and start to talk to each other, it's not about forgetting the wrong they may have done if they've done violence. What I'm saying is that not everything is defined by that lens. And what we have lost is our humanity because we've allowed and we've abdicated our responsibility to let others define how I should relate to Rachel, and others to define how I should perceive Rachel, rather than taking the time myself to interact with Rachel.
I agree with that. What would be because
we only have about 30 seconds left.
Well,
okay, so
there we go.
Yeah, and one thing I want to point out is Sim takes a lot of crap from the public for some of the decisions you make, and if you want to meet with Sim, you have an open office policy every Friday.
Every Friday for 22 years I've done it. You can come down and talk to me about anything and everything. And as an elected, you should have direct access to me, and I make myself available to you. If you want to yell at me, that's your right. It's your right, and it's my privilege. So
this has been a great discussion, and I appreciate everybody who's watching and listening. A reminder again that you can hear us every Saturday and Sunday morning at 10 a.m. on KKAT 860 AM in Salt Lake City. And for those of you around the world and around the state, thank you for watching another edition of Odyssey House Journals.